Hello, everyone, and welcome to the April 2023 Integration Down Under. We'll go through a couple of quick slides and then we'll get started. We have our organizers, Martin in Perth, Dan in Brisbane, Mick in Sydney, Wagner in Auckland, and myself here in Melbourne. And then tonight's speaker, we have Toon, and I'm going to let him say his surname. He can introduce himself, and because I knew I was going to get it wrong. But basically, we're going to hear about Azure API Management from a developer's perspective. So that's going to be very good because I think most of us, I know that I have done a fair bit of work with API management, and every time I go back to it these days, something major has changed in it. So it's a little bit of a learning curve there. So what I'll do is let me hand over the screen to Toon, and then we will get started. So add the stream, and then I will just turn it to where we've got, or actually, turn it to where we had just the slides, and we can go from there. Over to you, Toon.
All right. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And also thanks for having me here at the Integration Down Under webcasts. So indeed, as Bill mentioned already, this session is about Azure API Management from a developer perspective, because I often am in contact with API developers and so on. And I often see that the concept of API management and what value it can add to your APIs is not 100% clear. And that's the reason why I started this session. So first, a little word about myself. Most people say Toon Vanhoutte, but actually it's Toon Vanhoutte, but never mind, no worries. So I'm based in Belgium. I think it's almost noon over here. I'm CTO at Noost. With Noost, we want to make people's life easier and more efficient, and we do that by crafting solutions on the Microsoft stack. I've been also the founder of Your Azure Coach, where we provide tailored Azure trainings to infuse people with our experience so they can confidently design, build, and run Azure solutions. And I've been awarded as an Azure MVP for the last 5 years, I guess, mostly thanks to my contributions in the Azure integration space. It's still my first love and also my biggest love. And API management is one of the services I closely follow up. So that's why I'm probably doing quite some talks on that topic. All right, before we dive into the real Azure specific stuff, let's take a step back and let's focus on API management in general. Why do we need that? So in theory, APIs, you can build an application and it typically consumes several APIs. Like here an example, an inventory API, customer API, price API, whatever. It's already good if your APIs are modeled from a business perspective, so not from the systems that they sometimes represent, but that you really split your APIs in functional domains. So this is the theory. I want to build an app, whatever. I just connect to the APIs and we're good to go. The reality is, of course, a little bit different. We are dealing with many different standards. The SOAP standard is still out there. I don't see many new APIs being developed in SOAP, but at least quite some APIs just are out there and you need to consume them. RESTful APIs, of course, not every open API specification is purely the RESTful. We see also often just, I call it JSON RPC, and just using open API specification, but not the RESTful way. OData is also still popular. For example, if you need to connect to the Power Platform, the whole API over there is pure OData, so that's also a good one to know. And GraphQL is getting more and more traction. I have actually a dedicated session on that too, because it's one of the rising stars, let's say, in the API landscape. So quite some standards to connect with, so not always that easy. Next to that, the APIs are typically built in different languages. Those might get some implementation differences. Definitely in SOAP, I still know from the early days, .NET API and a Java API in SOAP, they had some different behaviors, some HTTP headers that were interpreted differently. So you sometimes need to take that difference into account. one aspect that gets more and more a reality is, of course, the different networks. You're working on premises, you're working maybe partially in the cloud. So you have a hybrid setup. You might have networks in the Azure cloud, and you might have also external networks that you maybe don't control because you're using SaaS products and so on. So it's always important, of course, that sometimes your consumers might be also in different networks, and you need to foresee the network security to connect securely across these network boundaries. Different platforms. It might be that you're just using plain virtual machines, but it might be that you're on the platform as a server or a serverless stack like Azure Functions or Lambda Functions. That's Google platform. So that's also just different implementations of APIs. And of course, different security. And with the SOAP, you have the WS security stack, which might be complex often. Sometimes you just don't have security. It might be that you just have a simple API key. Sometimes you get OAuth with Azure AD or any other external identity provider. So also challenges sometimes to deal with that. And the documentation is mostly a big pain, of course. If you're lucky, there is documentation. And sometimes you need to email people around in the organization to get a Word document or a PDF. If you're more lucky, it might be already on a Confluence page, or you have some automated documentation, like, for example, an Open API specification that can be rendered with a Swagger file. So also the level of documentation is quite different in many cases. And there are many other different stuff like limitations. Some APIs are really performant. Others, you need to be careful that you only do maybe 10 API calls in parallel. The way error handling is done is quite different, and also the monitoring. Some APIs might just have plain old log files on the server, while other APIs might have fully distributed tracing in Dynatrace, for example. So quite some differences, and also differences on the consumer side. It might be internal applications or even external trading partners that you're working with that consume your APIs. So you see, of course, if your organization looks like this, it's quite difficult to manage all of this. And it's also difficult from a consumer perspective because it's a very heterogeneous landscape. And this is actually where Azure API Management or any API management solution in general comes into place. So you can govern more. You have central governance of your whole API platform or program. And API management offers, I think, in general, 6 main functionalities. The first one is security, of course. That's in many cases the biggest reason why API management is being introduced. It might be that your backend APIs have all kind of different security flavors, and that you want to expose them in a very generic way, in a standardized security scheme towards your consumers. So that's where API management really shines. Routing might also be important. It might be that you have 2 APIs in the backend, but actually towards your consumers, you want to merge the functionality of those 2 APIs into a single API. That can be done with routing. So you can combine multiple backend APIs and expose them to your consumers as if they were a single API. So that's, again, hiding a little bit the complexity, your internal complexity. The more you can hide that to your consumers, the better, of course. Transformations is something we also quite often need to do. And I'm not talking about real business transformations where you put business logic. No, it's typically about syntactical transformations, like, for example, exposing SOAP endpoints as a RESTful interface. Because maybe you have 3 or 4 SOAP operations that you really want to expose to your consumers, but you don't want them to follow the SOAP standards. In that way, you can use API management to do the transformation from REST to SOAP or the other way around. Bear in mind, don't do any business logic over there. Just do it a pure technical transformation, a pure syntactical transformation. Next to that, API management can be used to optimize your APIs. Caching can be added, for example. And another feature that I pretty much like is versioning. You can have versioning and running versions side by side. If you have breaking changes, that you give your API consumers the time to migrate, let's say, within a certain time frame from version 1 to version 2. Analyzing, that's a very important one because all your traffic goes through your API management. You have, of course, one central place where you can monitor all the traffic. So that's one central place where you can investigate the issues. What are the most popular APIs? Which APIs are throwing the most exceptions? What's the performance of my APIs? Is the performance degrading over time and these kind of things? So you really see both a technical but also a business perspective on your API usage. You see what API domains are the most popular ones, and maybe we should additionally investigate over there to give extra functionality to our API consumers. And then last but not least is the engagement part. If you are a company that is really betting on API management and really having an API first strategy, it's important that your API consumers easily find the way to your APIs, to your documentation, and easily get onboarded. And that's something what an API management tool also can facilitate. And of course, of all these things, I will show a demo in this session. First, a little word about API management, Azure API management itself, because of course it might be new to you. So just a small recap. So it's important to understand API management is actually an abstraction, a facade between your API consumers and your backend APIs. So if the API consumer does a call, it does the call to API management. API management might execute some policies. Policies, those are XML files that change the configuration of the incoming request. And finally, after the policies are executed, your backend API gets invoked. And of course, when we invoke an API, the response also gets returned. So also on that response, you can apply policies to do maybe a transformation or to do additional logging. So this is actually very simple way how API management works. So thanks to the policies, you can transform SOAP into REST APIs. You can foresee logging, central monitoring, and you can do security checks like job token validation. You can do IP restriction. You can go quite crazy with all those policies. It's important to understand that you have policies as different scopes. So you have actually 4 scopes, but let's limit this session here to 3 scopes to keep it a little bit simple. First of all is the global policy, and that's maybe the most important one because the global policy gets executed for every single API call. And so what you often do there is if you have generic security that you want to enforce, that's typically something you do on the global level. If you want to have central monitoring, you want to monitor every single request, typically you add some policies on the global level for that. Of course, every API might have its own specific policies. For example, some APIs are not that performant than others, so you might have some rate limiting on top of it. In that case, it's better to go for an API-specific policy that is only executed for that specific API. So if you call that API, your policy gets executed. If you call another API, it has its own policy or maybe an empty policy. And you can go even one step further, and that's the operation level. So for example, caching is of course typical example. Caching, you won't do it on the API level, but typically on the operation. If you have a get/houses, for example, and you want to cache the response of the array of houses, that's typically something you can configure on the operation level. So I hope this gives you a slight introduction of what those policies are. In the demo, we will see those policies in action. One drawback, maybe, I'm a very big fan of API management, Azure API management, but the developer experience is not 100% fantastic. You will see it's a lot of configuration in XML files, which is not always that user-friendly. And that's why also in the demo, you will see that I do often copy pasting of XML snippets because I don't want you to see me typing because that's not that interesting. So that's, in my opinion, the only real downside from Azure API management. It's a little bit the developer experience with those XML policies. For the rest, fantastic tool. You can do quite a lot with it. I did many implementations with it and really fond of it. So now let's go into the demo part. If you are an API developer, what's in it for you? From what can you take benefits if you're using Azure API management? So the first thing is, of course, it can abstract away your implementation. So if you, for example, decide to start implementing your very simple API with logic apps because you can just gain speed, and later on you want to migrate to a real API which has the bulletproof error handling and so on, you can do that without impacting your consumers that are on this side. So because you virtualize somehow your API and the API consumers talk to this one, you can change this implementation. This can be a logic app to start with or Azure Functions, but maybe sometimes at a certain moment in time, you will hit the limitation of those technologies and you want to go maybe one step higher in the stack. You can do that without impacting your consumers. Of course, you need to respect your contracts. That's something you always need to do. But thanks to that abstraction layer on top of it, it allows you to change your implementation. And so that's one of the reasons API management is almost the first service that I put on every drawing board. Because if today you decide to go for technology A, but 5 months later you have the new insights and you want to go for another technology, you can do that without impacting your consumers. So in this demo, what I will show you is just a very simple sales API that I will import into API management. It's an open API specification and it has two operations, just simple get operations to get all the apartments that are for sale and to get all the houses that are for sale. So this is here my API management instance. And what I will do, I will create a new API. Let's delete this one first. Yep. And add a new API based on an open API specification. First thing it asks me, okay, where is your API specification? And I have here an API deployed in Azure. It's a very simple API with two operations, the get sales houses and the get sales apartments. I can just here copy the Swagger and the JSON file. That's what's needed for API management. It will read it. It's now importing it and it sees that it is actually the sales API. But I don't want to build a sales API. I want to build a real estate API, which will combine houses and apartments for sales, but also rental apartments and rental houses. So that's why I renamed this in the real estate demo API, because I have a real one already too. And we call this real estate demo, something like this. You see, this will be the URL of my API. Okay, let's consume this. Sorry, let's import this. And then you see that API management has recognized the two operations and just I will rename them. It's the display name renaming. So it's clear for everybody that these are the apartments for sale and these are the houses for sale. Just for clarity. All right. Save over here. And that's it. By default, you have a subscription key enabled on your API. So here in the settings, you have subscription keys. That's an API key that is mandatory to consume your APIs. But in my case, I don't want to use this. So I'll put my API without any security on public internet with this by removing this setting. All right. So if I go to Postman now, yes. And I take a new request and I just do a get sales / houses. I hopefully get a response back. Yeah, and you see here all the houses. It's an array of houses. Of course, it's a random array, so you will see that it always changes the number and the houses. So it's just a fake API. And here we have also the apartments that are for sale. So apartments, yep. If I send apartments, you see it's a different array. You have the has balcony flag, for example. And you see it just returns an array. So nothing fancy, but at least we are using now already API management in front of our real physical backend API. The next advantage of Azure API management is the fact that you can mash up new APIs. So in my demo scenario, I have also a rental API where we have the rental apartments available. But that rental API is a GraphQL API. But I don't want my app developers, to consume both the sales and the rental API. So that's why I will use API management to do a transformation. So it will expose on the front end, on the front door side, it will expose a get operation to do a get of the rental apartments. And in the backend, it will consume the rental API, the GraphQL API. And it will do the transformation both on the request, but also on the returned response. So let's see how we could do this. Just take my notes over here that I don't forget anything. Maybe the first thing that I should do is having a look at my GraphQL API. This is a GraphQL API. It's built with Hot Chocolate, the nice .NET library. And yeah, what you can do here, you can write your query. You give it a name and just do a test, for example. And then you should have some intelligence. So you see, it's a very simple API. It's not a extensive graph. I only have apartments available. And one of the advantage of GraphQL is that you choose what fields should be returned. So if you only want the city to be returned, you click on run, you have all the apartments, but only the city. You see again, it's always a random list, so there's no consistency over there. But if I would be also interested in the price, do it like that, and you see you have the price with it. So it's of course a very nice standard, this one, because you can call multiple entities in one round trip. You don't need to have chatty integrations, and you only fetch the data that you need. So you put quite some responsibility on the client side, which is, in my opinion, a very nice thing. I would like to talk hours about GraphQL. I have a dedicated session on that. It will be on Integrate. So if you're coming to Integrate, you can catch it up over there. So enough about this API. Let's now move it into our API in API management. So what I will do, I go to the design and I say, add a new operation. And I will call the operation get rental apartments. So that will be a /rental/ not a dot, but /apartments, like this. Voila. I click on save and I have here a new operation. Actually, I could test this operation already. So if I do here, instead of sales apartments, I do the rental /apartments. I get a 404 not found. And that's logical because actually what is API management doing? It is returning this, it is forwarding this to my open API, to my sales API. And of course there the /rental endpoint is not known. So the first thing I need to do is I need to say to API management that it should not go to the sales API, but it should go to my GraphQL rental API. And that's what we will do with a policy. So if you want to update a policy, you can update this policy, the all operations policy. You can just click on here, add a policy, or do it through XML code. But I only want to have this rerouting applicable on a single operation. So that's why I do update here the policy on the get rental apartments. I open up my policy pane. Let's do maybe some zooming in. Then here I have a policy prepared, which just simply says, we set the backend service to my GraphQL API. This is my rental API, my GraphQL API. So let's save this and then do another call. Typically, it takes 3 to 5 seconds before API management gets updated. And you see already I get a response. I get an error response because I'm doing actually a get on my GraphQL API. This is a typical, for people who worked with GraphQL, this is a typical GraphQL error. It's a bad request and it says, yeah, you didn't provide any query or whatever. So that's of course because I'm just forwarding my get operation to the GraphQL API. So what actually API management, what should it do? It should actually transform that get operation into a post with this GraphQL query. And that's what we will do right now. So let's update this policy. Let me just copy paste what I've prepared. So you don't need to see me constantly typing. Expand a little bit. I do it now in the portal. You can also nicely do this with Visual Studio Code. So that's supported over there. So what do we have? The first thing that I do is I set the method. So I change the HTTP methods. We are in the inbound. So this is on the incoming request. So we do a get, and I change the method actually to a post. So we will do a post on the backend side towards the GraphQL API, which is a must because GraphQL expects a post operation. The URI templates, currently on the inbound side, we have the rental/apartments, but GraphQL doesn't require a URI routes. It just requires a post on this endpoint. So that's why I do a rewrite of the URI and just say a slash over there. The request should have the content type application JSON. So I just add this and with the override here. So if it would already exist, the content type HTTP header, I will just change it. And then the most important part, I will update my body. So this is my HTTP body. When I do a get, my HTTP body is empty. But when I want to do a post on my GraphQL, I need to have this JSON where you have the query. And here I have my query, get all apartments, where I say, okay, give me all the apartments. And I want to have the city, the description, the price, and the has balcony flag. So let's save this and give it a try. You see, it took a little while, and now it's API management is updated, and now we get data back from our GraphQL API, but actually through RESTful endpoints. Just maybe you notice, but there's a small difference. If we go to the sales apartments, you see that the data is immediately the array of apartments. It's immediately at the root. But if you look at the rental apartments right now, you see that there's still a data and an apartments hierarchy above it. That's because this is the default GraphQL answer. So what I want actually to write a policy on my response. So this will be an outbound policy to strip away this part and only keep the array of apartments. So we have 100% match with the sales apartments. So luckily we can do this. So I can just, again, here expand and copy like this and say, okay, what I do, this is on the backend side. This should not be on the backend side, but on the outbound side. So the outbound is the response that is being returned. So what I do is I take the set body policy. The set body is used to modify the HTTP body. And I'll say, okay, I will parse the body of the response as a JSON object, and I select the data.apartments token. And I do that to a string. So that will ensure that we take this part and return that one. So if we do this and we test it again, you see it's already better. And now we have the desired response. So you see, that's quite nice. There's no difference anymore between the rental or the sales apartments right now, except for my consumer, they all feel both the same, but from a backend perspective, one is in GraphQL and the other one is in OpenAPI specification. Right. I also want to expose my rental houses, but there's one problem. Yeah, the API is still in development, but we want to return already some data so you can maybe start already developing on it. While we are developing the backend, we want the front end people also already to start developing. So that's why the concept of mocking is introduced, where you return fake data or static data. Mocking can also be a little bit dynamic. And what I will typically do here is I will put the expected response on a storage account, just as a JSON file on blob storage. And my API management will just point to that blob file. And that's actually a very nice solution if you want your front end people to be able maybe even to change the files. If they want to change the mock and they don't have knowledge about API management, you can just change the JSON files in the storage account. I once made a whole RESTful API just with one dynamic policy on top of such a blob storage, and it works really nice. So it can be a good alternative to do mocking. So let's have a look first at that blob storage. Just need to find my mouse back. Yep, here it is. If I go to my storage account, which should be here normally, and I go to my containers, I have a mocking container in my blob storage, and I have here the rental houses JSON. So I can click on it, do an edit normally. Where are you? Yeah, there are you. And you see, this is just a plain JSON of houses, rental houses that I want to return. So again, the same stuff. I will add a new operation here in the design. Get rental houses, like this. So I do the /rental/houses like this. We just save this. Yep. And then I need to point to my blob storage. So blob storage, you can access it, of course, through HTTP, which is a good thing. So I take here this policy, like this, expanding and maybe zoom in a bit. So what does it do? I make sure that we have a get. Okay, this might not be mandatory because my operation also has already a get. I set the backend service to my blob storage. So this is my storage account name, and this is the name of my container, my blob container, and this is here then a rewrite of the URI template where I say just go to the /rentalhouses.json. So if we save this, and we consume it right now. So in this case, I can go to rental/houses, if I'm not mistaken. And then we get a resource not found. So for the people who are familiar with blob storage, this is a typical exception that you get when you don't authorize against blob storage, because my blobs are not available on public internet, so you need to authorize with Azure Active Directory. And just to show you what I did already in advance, on my storage account here, if you go to the access control, I gave already access to the managed identity here. This is the managed identity of the API management I'm using. I gave it already storage blob data contributor rights. So my identity, system assigned managed identity of my API management has already the rights to access my blob. But of course, I need to authorize also towards my blob storage. So that's why I need to update my policy to ensure that we use managed identity to go to the backends. And we can do that via this way. Just let me copy paste this in, expand, zoom, like this. The magic is actually in this one here. We say, please API management use managed identity, and do that against the storage.azure.com resource. This is the one that is needed for authorizing against blob storage. And we say, please authenticate with your system assigned managed identity. What will this do in the backend? It will add an HTTP header, the authorization header, with a bearer token that originates from my system assigned managed identity. So thanks to this header, I will have access, I will have the right authorization header in my request to blob storage. One special thing that you need to do is you need to set the version of blob storage, because it's only since this version that Azure AD authentication is supported. If you don't add this explicit header, that version header, you will end up in trouble. So let's save this. Let's go now. Wait a little bit. Yeah, and there we are. And you see here, we get it back. You see the city is Kortrijk. This is where I currently am. So if I don't want to have Kortrijk displayed, I should be able here to go to my blob storage, to my container, mocking, and replace this by Sydney, for example. I hope I'm not... Yep. So if I now do an update, you see we have Sydney. So it's just directly on the blob storage that it connects. What difference you might see is that this is not being rendered as a JSON. You see it's, and this is because the HTTP response header, the content type is not set. Because by default, if you access blob storage, the content type is an octet stream. So what we can do here in API management to make it fully good, I can say here on the response, of course. So this is my outbound. I can say set HTTP header. Oh, my apologies. There's a policy here. Where is it? Set header. Yep. You need to provide the name of the header. So this is content type. You can override, skip, append, or delete. And the value is application/JSON. If I save this one, you should see that the color will change. So now it's just gray, and now you see it's completely parsed and recognized as being a JSON. So this is, of course, good for the compatibility with your clients. Let's go back to my demo. Another advantage that you have of API management is that you can have end-to-end traceability. So what you can do, you can connect both your backend APIs and your Azure API management to the same application insights instance. And that makes it very handy because then you have both traces from your API management, but also from your backend service correlated with each other. So this is very nice. And yeah, with GraphQL, this can become very nice and very complex. So this is what I will do in this part of the demo. So let me go to my API management. Where are you? Over here. And I can say, dear API management, create me a logger in application insights. You see, I have already quite some loggers available, but I can just select an application insights instance. I will take the same instance as my backend APIs. So this is in this environment, and I will just create a one. You see, I have already one, so it's just updating, creating a second one here, this one, the API one. What I can now do, I need to go to my API, and there I can configure on this real estate demo API. I can say settings. And here at the bottom, you see I enable it. Oh, yes, there we are. And then to which logger do you want to send? So this is here my demo logger. Yep. You can configure sampling, always log errors. Do you want to have the client IP? It might be for GDPR reasons not possible. You can have custom metrics. That's a very nice thing. You can check the verbosity, the correlation protocol, whatever. And you can even log the first bytes of your payloads. And even go advanced and choose it for every request. Do you want to have the front-end request, front-end response, and the back-end request and response? Do you want all of them to be logged? So I put it here to the maximum, of course. Be careful if you do that on a production environment, because everything you do with logging, even though it is optimized and all done asynchronously within API management, always be aware that it has a footprint, a performance impact. So Just double check. Yeah, it was saved successfully. So just need to double check that one. So now if I call my API, yeah, I don't. Let's maybe do the sales, the rental apartments like this. Only API. Voila. You might notice here that every request that I do, the response of every request contains a request ID. So if I do another, you see it's always another GUID that it gets generated. This is a policy that I have at global level. So we uniquely identify every request ID. And that request ID, maybe I can show you here in the portal. This is on the all API level. This is a global policy. You see over here, I have policy fragments. Those are reusable policy fragments that you can inject. I have here the inbound request ID fragment. And if I go to there, where are we? Here, policy fragments. I can click on this fragment and then you see the policy code over there. You see, I will not go into detail, but what I do, I make a custom trace of the correlation ID and I add it to the HTTP header. So it's also propagated downwards. Consumers can also create their own request ID. So if they want to have end-to-end correlation, they can just populate the FTW request ID, and then we will take that one in our logs. So if we now go to our application insights that is linked to this API management and also linked to the backend service, you can go, for example, to live metrics. And this is just showing you an overview of what's currently happening live in your application. So if I click on send, you should see here that there are 2 requests coming in. Why 2 requests? You might wonder, you only did 1 request. Well, we have one request in API management and also one in my backend API. So for my distributed logs, this means actually 2 requests on 2 different components. But you will see that they are correlated with each other. So if you go to the application map, I don't think there's much fancy stuff in here, but you will at least see that here my API management instance is connecting to the rental API. So I didn't do any optimizations, but at least this is already what you see. I see it's quite slow today, application insights, not sure what's going on. The cool thing is when, remember that I copied, maybe you saw me copying here the request ID. If I now can search with this request ID, do a refresh, then hopefully, yeah, I see the results. This is my trace that I did in API management. And if you then click here on view timeline, you can actually see what happened. Okay, so this is my API management front end. You see even the response that was returned. This was the response that was returned. And you see that we actually did a get on the real estate demo / apartments, but in the backend, it did actually a post on the GraphQL. So you see also the response here towards the GraphQL and so on. You see also the request that has been done to the GraphQL. And this is then my web application that is now doing not that much monitoring, but normally if this one goes to a database and so on, you find also all these traces over here. So we have nice end-to-end correlation, and the good thing is with this request ID, you can always find back the logs of your unique API call. Let's get back to the demo. Last thing I want to do is, of course, adding some security, because currently my sales API is open on public internet and also my API management is open on public internet. So the first thing I want to do is making sure that people cannot contact my sales API directly. I only want them to call my sales API through API management because I will enforce the security over there. So I don't want people to bypass the API management. So that's why I will configure the sales API or the rental API. I don't care which one I will take with an IP restriction, and I will only allow the static IP address of API management. And then in API management itself, I will enforce Azure AD authentication. So let's see how we could do this. Let's start with the IP restrictions. I can go here to my sales application here. So this is an app service, but if you're using container apps or any other technology, almost all of them support IP restrictions. You can go to the networking tab and you can configure an access restriction. And I can say, okay, by default, I want you to deny all traffic unless we have a matched rule. So I can add a rule right now, which says only allow API management. I give it, and I need to provide an IP address. So if I go to my API management over here, I can copy the IP address and strip this out. And I think we need the address block. So I just do a /32, which means only allowing this single IP. So by default, everything, if I save this and confirm, everything should be denied by default. We do deny all unless we have a match of my API management. So what should happen right now? If I go to my backends API, so this one here, just double check it. This is my rental API, and I did the configuration on the sales API. Oh no, this is sales API, so I'm good. Yeah. So if I go here to, what was it again? Sales/houses, I get a forbidden. So this is nice. I cannot call directly anymore my backend API because it only allows the IP address of API management. Let's check if we can do here still the houses the sales/houses. This one still works. So through API management, we can still do the get on the sales houses, but on the backend not. So this is already nice because we cannot bypass anymore our backend APIs. Of course, we should also do it for the rental API, but it's exactly the same. So let's skip this one in the demo. Another thing I want to do is having security, Azure AD security on API management. And actually, I configured this already on another API because on the other API, I have already my real estate API, the real one. And if I go to that API, you will see that I have already security over there. I have a policy which is called the validate JOT policy. And actually, you can just provide an OpenID config URL, and API management will then fetch the JWK set. So the public signing keys will be fetched, so you can validate the signature. It will also this one will also validate by default the expiration, and you can say here, okay, I need to make sure that I want to validate on a certain audience. I want to have the issuer be correct. And I have here a dynamic claims validation. What I actually say is, if you want to do a get on this API, you need to have the roles claim, which says, okay, the ID of the API dot reads. And if you want to do write something else than a get, you need to have the write access. So this sounds pretty technical, I can assume. But this will do the JOT token validation. So if I now try to call that API here, where is it? My real estate API, so not the demo anymore. So I just take here the URL like this. I try to call it. We should get an unauthorized because I don't have an authorization header. So I could now do, of course, I can create my own authorization header, but maybe I can do it differently. I can go through the developer portal of Azure API Management. So Azure API Management has a developer portal. It's not that fancy. It's just a starting point. But it has a developer portal which allows the consumers of your API to discover the APIs they have access to. They can browse them and they can even test those APIs. So let's go to my prepared developer portal. So I should have it over here. So you can change a little bit the look and feel, not too fancy, but at least you can change the look and feel. I should be already logged in with Azure AD, so that's also supported. And I can here explore my APIs. So you see, I have access to two APIs. The real estate API is the one I will try right now. I can try the get apartments for sale. And if I call this, I get an unauthorized. Why? Because I didn't authorize, of course. So here I can change, I want to use the authorization code flow. You see it logs me in. It did it quite quickly because it uses single sign-on. So it did log me in. You see an authorization header has been added. If I now look at this better token, like this, if I just decode this, then you see that I have a role claim. And I have a role claim which gives me read access on the real estate API version 1, which is the one I'm currently consuming. So I hope with this better token, I can now send, and I hopefully get a response. Yeah, I get my response back. But if I now try the post, remember that I only have read access. I should get an access denied here. So if I click send over here, I'm unauthorized. Any get operation that I do, I should be authorized. So this is how the AD security can work. And this is fully supported through the authorization code flow in the developer portal. It's limited what you can do with this developer portal. I think it's in most cases sufficient for internal usage. For external usage, I see that many customers are building their own version of this. So this concludes a little bit my demo. We started with a very simple sales API and we ended up with a completely secured API that meshes up both a GraphQL and an Open API specification, added some mocking, and also did some monitoring over there. So the conclusion is, remember that API management has quite some advantages. Definitely, if you look at it from an enterprise perspective, maybe from your own scope, if you're building your own small application, it might be overkill, and sometimes it is. But if you really look at this from an organization perspective, it brings a lot of value. And that's why also Azure API Management is often a shared component within the whole organization. And remember, as a developer, it allows you to change your implementation. So you can change your mind afterwards, which is, of course, a very assuring feeling. I sometimes call it's DNS for APIs. You can mash up new APIs. If you need to do mocking, you can use Azure API Management for that. If you're using API management, please think about end-to-end traceability. The little trick with the correlation ID might help you a lot when you are in production and you need to troubleshoot some issues. Of course, think about security, because I often see API management implementations with very, very, very poor security. So it's important that you think about the security both on your front door, so the security between your consumers and API management, but also towards the back door, API management towards your backend API, because you don't want people to bypass your API management and bypass part of your security. And of course, you can get broader adoption, because when your API, your small API, is published on the whole organization API management, you might get just better usage of your API. And in the end, I think that's what we want as developers. If you build something, you want people to use it. Otherwise, you feel useless. So that's why API management can get you a broader audience across your company or even across the company borders. If you're interested in more, I would say, follow my blog on yourazurecoach.com, blogging quite a lot about API management, to be fair. I'm also working on a fictitious company, FTW Ventures. So it's on GitHub. There's quite some automation code on API management already, quite some bicep with API management. And there's a whole complete GraphQL demo. The code is already there. The documentation is still work in progress. That's something for the coming weeks. But if I update the documentation, you will get notified through my blog. So that might be maybe the best location to look for. And then I guess if you want to contact me afterwards, you can scan the QR code. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, email. No worries. And if there are any questions right now, I'm happy to tackle them. And otherwise, if you look at the recording, I'm always happy to, tackle some questions afterwards. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Toon. Let me just put our questions up. I haven't seen any questions show up in the from YouTube, but again, a lot of times we get a lot of people watching the recordings afterwards instead of that. Let me bring everybody back in. I apologize today. My webcams decided to take holidays, but other than that, one of the things I want to have a look at with API management here soon is the workspaces.
Yep.
Because I saw that is now in preview, and that looks fairly interesting. Because I've had a fewer bigger organizations look at it and want to be able to kind of segregate their different groups so that they can't kind of stomp on APIs from the other groups. And it looks like that workspaces feature will do that. But I did notice when I had a look at it a couple of weeks ago that the bicep stuff was missing for workspaces still. There wasn't the ability to automate the deployments of the workspaces stuff. So it did. The REST API was there, but there wasn't anything in the ARM templates or the bicep stuff yet.
Oh, okay, it's still in preview, so I think that will come quite soon. But indeed, it allows you, because API management is often also because of its price. If you implement it in an enterprise, you typically end up with a premium tier. So it's a quite expensive component. So typically you want to share that across different teams. And that's really where the workspaces comes in. Every team can get its dedicated workspace and has its mini API management within the shared API management service. So everybody gets your freedom within the API management, but you share the compute and you share the service. So it's very nice if you're working in a distributed organization where you want to give a lot of responsibility to some business units and so on. So
that was the questions I was getting previously with some API management projects, and I have a couple of customers that they are sharing some API management, but they've got some separate API managements set up for particular groups.
Yeah, I think that's really the use case, because I have other customers where they have a kind of a center of excellence on APIs and API management, and they have the full automation on top of it. In that case, the teams don't even have access to API management. They just have read access and everything is automated. If you're in such a more centralized organization, I think the workspaces doesn't make that much sense. It's more if you want to really distribute the responsibility within the organization, that workspaces really becomes valuable.
Yeah, and again, everybody's looking at cost. You don't want 3 copies of Enterprise.
That's true.
if you can help from it, things like that. So, but no, I've automated all of like the API restrictions and things like that in my templates that I deploy.
Nice.
So it automatically picks up the like for my Logic app exposed through API management, it picks up the IP address of the API management and puts it into the Logic app. So that's the only thing that it can be called.
Yeah, that's cool stuff. And the more you can automate these things, of course, the safer you are. Otherwise, we are all human beings. We forget it, but when it's automated and automatically, it's much better.
Any of you got Mick or Dan? Any questions?
Mick here. My camera's playing up as well for some bizarre reason. But Toon, that was great. Thanks very much for that. My question is really around, let's say in the absence of workspaces and things, how realistic do you find being able to put different environments through the shared API management? So you might be deploying the one solution. So let's say you're developing a larger platform with maybe 50 or 60 different APIs. And certainly mashing them or combining them together was quite important. And sort of presenting a simplified composite view of sort of some underlying APIs. I mean, it was a great demo. There's so much there, and I've actually got a sort of a love-hate relationship with GraphQL, but I won't go there for now. My question is around, let's say you're developing product and you want to sort of set up different environments. So let's say you've got your dev, let's say, and you've got then maybe your UAT or some sort of test, and you might have a couple in there, and then obviously production. How viable is it to let's say have the one API management that you're going to share across, let's say dev, test, and staging or pre-prod or so, and then because you've got your 50 APIs that you're pushing out, let's say call it what would you say, rental or sales. Let's say it's your sales APIs, and you've got these different environments, and they they correspond to different deployments in Azure. So you've got dev sales APIs, you've got staging sales APIs, and you've got pre-prod, or you've got test or something like that, and then obviously you've got the production environment. And what I get a lot of the time is, how do we share that infrastructure, and is it viable, or is it a natural follow-on that we use the one API, the one shared API instance, if you like, in that case? Because if we did, let's say we do consumption, we lose the developer portal aspect of what we're trying to do. So you typically want to go on to developer or standard, but developer more so. And these APIs aren't in production yet, so they're very much pre-production type. So the one set of sales APIs is going to be API management instance / dev / sales APIs. The next one's going to be / staging / sales APIs, and test or something. How viable is that in terms of, how much do we get many clashes in API management over that stuff, or can we keep it nice and separate? Long-winded question, I apologize.
No worries, no worries. It's a question I quite often get. My first recommendation is always don't share compute across environments, because somebody might be performance testing on UAT. A dev might maybe change by accident your global policy, and the global policy is shared for every single API you have. You might impact your production. So the minimum you should have, I guess, is a non-production and a production environment. Mm-hmm. What I've seen often, the price for non-production API management is quite low. I think you're at 50 euros or 40 euros, something like that, for a developer instance. So there, I'm more a fan of doing your automation just a dedicated instance for dev, a dedicated for test, and a dedicated for prods, than complicating your automation to try to have 3 environments inside one API management instance. It works, you can do it, but the risks are on the higher ends. So, some companies do it. You need to well automate everything, but then you still share the compute, and sharing compute across environments is not always a good idea, in my opinion.
Sounds good.
Yeah, one of the things you would have to do, I think, is you'd have to prefix all of your policies with the environments you wanted to keep from clobbering those. Because I did a similar thing with the integration account. Because we all know why, but Yeah. So, but that was to try to be able to leverage one instead of multiples. But I had every resource that was in there had a prefix.
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe one option now, Mick, of course, if you have workspaces, they were completely isolated from each other. So you might use workspaces to segregate between dev test and UAT, for example. So there you have the real segregation. So that would take away the complexity of your prefixing and stuff, but you still have the shared compute, and that's a risk you take or leave, of course. But it might help if you really have reasons to share your API management instance, whether it's cost or overheads. I think the workspaces can help you because they are completely isolated from each other. The only thing that they share is the compute, the underlying compute.
Yeah. Okay.
Anything, Dan?
With the workspaces, can you keep the naming the same then across, so there's no collision and the...
That's the naming can be the same indeed, but I'm not 100% sure. But I assume that your URI paths need to be unique, of course, because they get appended on the same API management gateway.
Yeah, I think the workspace has must have some sort of prefix in it. So
I need to
How
double
far
check.
away are workspaces, or what's where are we up to with workspaces?
It's in preview. You can see it out there. You can create it. But what I said a couple of weeks ago when I had to play with it is there's nothing, and I mean all my API management stuff's automated deployments, so I couldn't. The ARM templates and the Bicep doesn't support workspaces yet, so I couldn't deploy anything. But you can go out and create there and see what you get is you get all the policy, you get unique policies, unique users, unique subscriptions, and unique APIs.
So what about the APIs that you're exposing then? So let's say you've got workspace 1 and 2, and going back to that sales API.
Yep.
Does it automatically prepend the workspace 1 and 2 into the URL?
I didn't get that far looking at it too, but I'm assuming it has to keep you from clobbering the other one.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't have two different groups in the organization creating the same API. And there's got to be some protection in workspaces to prevent that. So I'm assuming there's going to be like a workspace ID. So you assign each team a different workspace, and then they have a preview in there. If you got that, I'll add you back to the stream. And you actually, you have to go create one.
Oh, okay.
And then if you create just to create an API.
Yeah, I'm also double checking here what happens.
Yeah.
So have you allocated that to a workspace, Bill?
He's in the workspace right now.
Oh, Toon, sorry, if that's yeah.
You see up at the top screen, it says he's in the workspace.
Oh, test ID or the.
But no,
it's not in. So I'm just doing the test and it's not in. So here, this is my API, and this is the.
I wonder if there's workspace settings in there that you can set.
Yeah. So I have now just my operation here. Yeah.
Because I think I think that's quite common in the sense that even let's say we want to do prod or not necessarily prod, but you do want to share some environments or even share across different teams, and different teams might use different stages of APIs.
Can you click on the settings there in the workspaces over there on the left and see if you no, that's just display name.
Nope.
Okay.
it'd just be good to be able to have a little bit more control over that, and sort of, because ultimately this is a routing, as you say, it's a gateway, it's a routing vehicle, and you are pointing it to different back end instances, let's say, of an API in progress. So, you do want version 1, you do want version 2. Now we do that quite well because we're quite familiar with that. So we do have version 1 and, pre or somewhere in the path, let's say. But, I think it's quite plausible to have that across environments as well, using, not necessarily prod. I get what you're saying with prod, but, as you said, non-prod. So some team might come in and say, hey, we want to use the beta channel. We want to use the test channel of, and those APIs are deployed in the back end in real concrete versions somewhere. And maybe the beta channel is sort of nightly updated, the test is weekly updated, but they're the same sales APIs. And it just seems a bit of overkill to go and create more API instances, but you really want that dev portal. So you do go the developer or above version as opposed to the consumption version.
I think we need to get the API management guys to organize a PGI.
Yeah.
And let's talk about workspaces.
Yeah, I'll have it on my agenda to play a little bit more with it next week. So watch out for my blog. There will be maybe the first mornings.
Steve, we've given you some great blog material, Pete.
Yep. Thanks, guys. I think we'll call it quits there, and I will end the broadcast. You guys can stay on if you want, because once I end the broadcast, we'll be still there. So let me in. Thanks, everyone, for attending. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to either the Integration Down Under Twitter or to direct to Toon. That's fine. So I'm going to end the broadcast now.
Beautiful.